So you have another opportunity before the afternoon program, and what a fantastic set of discussions we've had today from our members and guests, and I want to thank all of them so much for their contributions. And now we have a very special treat, and it's my honor to introduce and moderate the President's Science Advisor, the Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy, Dr. Arati Prabhakar. And I think we all want to congratulate her for coming back from California to assume this leadership role at a critical time, as we were saying this morning, a Sputnik moment. So thank you very much for that.
So much. That's very kind.
And I have to say, as a woman of a certain age, it's been incredible to see that you have been a woman of firsts in many, many things. You know, the first director of NIST, you were director of DARPA, not the first woman, but the second.
Right.
And then, of course, the first presidential science advisor and director of OSTP, as well as being a venture capitalist. And, you know, you all have Dr. Prabhakar's bio, but she really captures the American story, her journey coming from India at 3 years old and everything she's accomplished for our country and continues to do so. So you have a big responsibility on your hands now in the White House with all the new legislation, the CHIPS Plus Act, the infrastructure, and you gave a major talk recently on the aspirations of science and technology. So we'd love to hear, you know, your priorities and what you think it's going to take to capitalize on this momentum in our history for competitiveness.
Thanks, Deborah. And I just want to start by saying what a pleasure it is to be here with all of you. This is a group that I have known and have gotten to work with over many, many years. And as I think many people have pointed out, the time has come for the work that the Council on Competitiveness has been doing. So I was really happy to be with some old friends as well as new faces and have a chance to talk about this. I'm coming into this role just feeling incredibly privileged to get to work on science, technology, and innovation for America at this particular moment in time. Because the role that, you know, all of you are engaged in this, the role that science and technology and innovation has played in the progress of our country in every dimension of shaping the modern world has been to change what's possible. And if you look ahead now here we are, it's almost 2023, and with all the strides of progress that have been made, I think it's, even knowing what we can do, it can really be daunting to think about the major aspirations that we have as a country going into this century that is still new for us. Because if you think about it, we live in America in a time when our health outcomes are simply unacceptable for the richest country in the world. And a lot of the abundant opportunities that this country has to offer, too many people can't access them. And so one of our aspirations is to make sure that we have robust health and abundant access to opportunity in every zip code in our country. We're dealing with a climate crisis that we aspire to turn into an opportunity to reimagine our infrastructures and to reimagine our relationship with nature in a way that works for the future. We are living in a time in which national security is not something we can take for granted because of the way the world continues to change and the geopolitical shifts and the technological shifts that are happening. And we're living in a time in which our democracy, I think we have seen, is more fragile than we would like, and reinvigorating our democracy is key to making sure that we thrive as a country going forward. All of those goals rest on being an economically competitive America, one that, as the president likes to say, has an economy that's built from the bottom up and the middle out, that doesn't just serve a few very wealthy people, but really lifts our entire country. And I think the combination of the stresses across our society and the polarization, the geopolitical change with China, and then the crisis of the pandemic has really brought into the spotlight the need to shift our thinking about the government's role in economic competitiveness. And I think a lot of the things that we're now moving out on are the first steps to redefining that relationship.
Well, I'm going to come back and ask for a little bit more on those topics of aspiration, but you know, you are now, and this is something the Council's pushed for many years, a member of the cabinet, which is wonderful, in addition to being the director of OSTP. And one of your institutional functions is to coordinate the research priorities, the big national programs across a big federal agency that has massive resources coming in. And so I wanted to ask you, how have you begun to undertake that coordination role? And you think sitting at the president's cabinet is a great elevation now of science and technology and the importance to our nation?
Yeah, I'll talk about both of those pieces. I think, the president, this president made this role a cabinet level appointment. And if you think about it, it's completely consistent with how he thinks about the world. One of the reasons that I was so excited to come work for Joe Biden as president is because of his statement that the one word that defines America is possibilities. And that is, that's why I get out of bed in the morning. I think most of us who get to be involved in innovation think that way about what the potential that our country holds and the role that we get to play in realizing that. And that is so central to his vision of the country that I think that is really what was behind his decision to make this a cabinet level position. So what does that actually mean? I mean, it's a great honor, but how do you use that to actually get the work done? And to me, the real opportunity here is, I think all of us know from the work that we've all done, that doing the innovative work, showing that new things are possible, is absolutely necessary, but that in itself doesn't change the way the future unfolds, and that getting the changes, whether it's commercialization through our incredibly powerful market system, or whether it's changing the policies and the practices and the norms that allow us to take advantage of breakthroughs and start turning them into gains for the American people. That is the work that requires much more than scientists and engineers, and I'm starting to see ways in which being able to work with my fellow cabinet members allows us to now be, I hope, become more and more effective at using the fruits of science and technology.
Well, I know with your personality and your record, you will be forceful in articulating these at the cabinet level, but I can just say from my experience many years ago in OSTP, serving as a detailee from the National Science Foundation in the Reagan years, the position was not a cabinet level, and so we were often frustrated if there was something coming out of the Justice Department or Treasury, OMB, of not being able to bring the science and technology component and how they integrate as a system. So are you seeing now on these expenditures that we're going to have and the opportunity with the CHIPS Plus Act that there's going to be a lot of coordination, and maybe talk about the semiconductor challenge too?
I love to talk about semiconductors because I first came, this is my third tour in Washington. Twice I've left really sure that I was done, and apparently I was wrong twice. Who knows what my track record there is. But I first came to Washington in 1984, and I came fresh out of graduate school. I worked for the Congressional Office of Technology Assessment as a congressional fellow, and my first job was writing a study on microelectronics R&D because semiconductor physics had been the area of my thesis work. And since that time, because just at about that time our industry started understanding that it no longer had all the marbles, that there was going to be global competition, and that at that time it was the Japanese that were surging ahead. And literally since that period in the mid-'80s, I think all of us have understood, the industry certainly has understood, that this industry was first globalizing, and then eventually it was getting dangerously concentrated in a part of the world, particularly Taiwan, that any degree of concentration is unsafe just given natural hazards. And then, of course, on top of that, the geopolitics of Taiwan has now, over all these decades, we've now ended up in a particularly fragile place. And then, of course, the pandemic showed us precisely how fragile that situation was, because, of course, a pandemic shuts down production lines in Asia, and all of a sudden auto workers in the Midwest in America don't have a job to go to. That really got everyone's attention. It crystallized something that the slow-moving disaster all of a sudden became very, very visible. And I have to say that somewhat to my shock, after 4 decades, our Congress actually passed, and the President has now signed, a piece of legislation that that redefines our relationship with industry, that says that in addition to what the industry does and what the global markets do, there are things we need to do as a country to have the robust supply chains that support the jobs, not just the direct jobs, but all the jobs that rely on being able to have these important components. And we need access to these leading edge technologies for our national security purposes, military and intelligence. And the CHIPS Act really represents a marked departure, and I felt incredibly lucky in my timing because that legislation passed, and it involves many departments of government, to your point about having to connect all the dots. But the steering committee at the White House for the CHIPS Act, I get to co-chair that with Jake Sullivan from the National Security Council and Brian Deese from the National Economic Council. Our first meeting, in which we met with Secretary Raimondo, who's going to be here shortly, as well as senior people from the Department of State, National Science Foundation, Department of Defense. That first meeting was my first week on the job, and it was a terrific opportunity to see how quickly these people doing the different components of the work on chips, how quickly but also how smartly they were going after doing something that we have not done possibly ever, certainly for many, many, many decades. And I think it's a huge challenge to figure out how to build the right kind of partnership with industry to get what the country needs and allow our industries to thrive. But I'm more and more encouraged as I see the quality of the work that has started up.
And I believe this week the Private Sector Advisory Committee on the semiconductors met at NIST, that's actually chaired by our former vice chair, Mike Splinter.
Oh, that's great. Oh,
So,
with a lot of detailed expertise from his industry, for
yes.
sure. Yeah.
And you know, when you look back at the efforts we made, you referred to the 80s with Sematech, which was one of the very early but significant co-investments from the defense and bringing together the equipment and materials. What do you think now, you know, fast forward, is fundamentally different in how we're going to build the manufacturing infrastructure for this in America?
This is very different because it is about manufacturing capacities that we need. And I think we have to be really clear that it is not the same as R&D, whether it's Sematech style joint R&D or the many other kinds of R&D that you know, we have a very robust system to do. And recognizing that it's very different, I think there are actually some very important lessons that we can draw from. And to me, the central lesson is what it means to build an effective partnership. Because again, we're trying to do something for the country here, as we did with Sematech, as we do with most of our R&D. We're trying to do something that the country needs, that government can't do by itself, and that companies can't do by themselves. And if you're going to build an effective partnership, you have to be clear about who brings what to the table and who gains what from the table. And so we very much see the government's role as being clear about what the country needs, which again keeps coming back to robust supply chains and supporting workers in these industries, but in the industries that depend on semiconductors, and then the national security aspects, making sure we have access to the leading edge. And you know, if we keep our eye on that ball and then we team with industry for all the things that companies know and that the market can inform, then I think that's how we've succeeded in so many cases in R&D, and that I think can be the basis of a very, you know, my hope is a very successful outcome from CHIPS.
Well, you know, you have also, of course, played a role as a partner in venture capital firm and invested in companies. We had a discussion this morning about, you know, the challenges of from startup to scale up, and, you know, I made the comment, let's get over hearing about the valley of death, which seems to be the proverbial thing for the last, you know, 30 years. But on the issue of accessing the capital at scale for some of these massive investments, do you think that the financing models we have are adequate, or do we need to be innovative in how we bring financing to this whole enterprise as well now? Because, of course, China Inc. is putting massive billions of dollars, not just in the semiconductors, but AI and quantum and everything. So is that something that, you know, in your role at OSTP, and also sitting next to the Treasury Secretary, you could think of some new regulations, incentives to kind of unleash some of the capital beyond the venture capital world?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think there are a lot of pieces in what you said, and the fundamental question is, what kinds of capital need to come to the table, again, to get done what we need for this country. And what I'll tell you just some specific examples that I remember from my venture capital life. I was in early stage venture capital from 2001 through the end of that decade. And especially towards the end of that decade, many of you will remember there were so many interesting research advances and technologies coming out of our university labs, specifically in areas like new battery chemistries or new photovoltaic technologies. And over and over again, what we would see was enthusiastic venture capital that would start this company up with a couple of brand new PhDs, and they would be able to hatch things out of the lab, but then very quickly when you got to the next step, which was pilot scale production, and then looking ahead from that, moving into full scale production, all of a sudden, number one, the capital needs skyrocketed, and that is not like a software business that venture capitalists know how to make huge returns on. But the problem, I think, really was that the capital needs skyrocketed at a time where the risk was still huge, because we have capital that knows how to deploy billions and trillions once the risk has been knocked down and you can get a reliable return. But when you're at this early pilot stage, you need lots of dollars and the risk is still immense. And when that happened over and over and over again, I saw these companies not being able to raise capital or build in the United States, but finding very ready partners, not just in China, but in Singapore, Malaysia, many other places, because there was manufacturing interest, there was subsidized infrastructure, and there was low-cost capital willing to take that risk. Now, whether or not that capital is going to generate the returns that we would demand in our market, that's a different question. But what it meant was that these critically important technologies, in some cases, they germinated here, but they had to get repotted, and then they grew somewhere else. And so then the question is, well, how do you get that to come out differently so that we keep we want to keep winning Nobel Prizes, but we would like to have jobs here in America too. And back to chips, the manufacturing incentives portion of chips is precisely about unlocking private capital and getting huge leverage on those government dollars in order to get a different kind of manufacturing to happen here. And I think it's one example, but there may be other areas. And I think there's interesting innovation and approaches in different parts of government to think about that. How do you unlock the strategic capital that we need?
Well, it's certainly an issue that the Council on Competitiveness is committed to working on, and Phase 2 of our National Commission on Innovation and Frontiers. And so we look forward to your guidance and thoughts on that as we move forward. You talked about the importance of knitting together the strengths and assets of our diverse country, and place-based innovation is a hallmark of the Biden administration policies across agencies, but it's also something, that the Council, we've been champion since we did the first studies back in the late 90s on regional clusters of innovation. What are your thoughts on how we can really expand the capabilities and the partnerships throughout the country, in addition to these great hubs, whether it's Silicon Valley, Kendall Square, et cetera, et cetera. And I know you're very much committed to that. What do you think are some of the challenges, but what can we do on the place-based innovation?
This has to happen, because the greatness of this country can't just be concentrated and available to a very lucky few. And the resources that we have, the people that we have across every zip code in the country, and the problems that can be understood in specific regions because of what's there, whether it's agricultural or other clusters where people actually know what the issues are and have the germs of ideas that can really start unlocking innovation. We have to find ways to nurture those and unlock them. And I think there are many pieces to that puzzle. NSF, with its new Technology Innovation and Partnerships Directorate, the first new directorate in many, many decades at NSF, is one piece of that puzzle. And I think it's important, in my mind, it's important to view these approaches as experiments, because great research has been done about how clusters grow and how regional innovation develops, but there's not a recipe yet, right? And so I think we have to view these as experiments from which that we try and we learn and we adapt as we go. but I think the number of experiments we're able to run today are important. So I'll mention NSF and TIP as one example. Another area I think has to do with worker training. And again, this is something where we've seen states and regions do some excellent projects that have, they have led to hundreds or thousands of workers being able to get linked into, we know we've got so many jobs that have got to get filled today, and we have people who want to find better and more interesting career paths. But we seem to know how to do that for hundreds or thousands of people, and I think this question of how you scale that and make it work across all the regions of the country, I think there are huge opportunities there as well.
And the Economic Development Administration of the Department of Commerce, as well as, agriculture, they all have components of economic development, and I think that's another part of the coordination to ensure that we're utilizing those authorities and facilities and resources. We're going to have next March, the 28th and 29th, the second Council Regional Innovation Summit. It will be hosted at UC Davis by Chancellor Gary May. So we want to get that on your calendar. We know you have reasons to go to California, but we'd be honored for you to come and speak at that, because we're going to roll this out across the country with many new university members of the council and new companies that are very committed to this, and including historically black colleges and universities and our Hispanic colleges and colleagues as well. And we built on the Mountain West Summit this summer out in Wyoming, and coming out of that is a new alliance of the universities of those states on innovation. So that's a tangible outcome.
That's great to hear about. I'm really glad to hear that the council's moving in that direction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you talked about workforce development, and of course we have labor members, and the jobs of the future don't all require college education, a graduate, but what are your thoughts of how we can really turbocharge our workforce development in a highly digitized economy? Because the skill sets are totally different than a 20th century more physical economy.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. And one thing that I'm watching in the conversation about STEM education is, for a long time, it seemed to me to be mostly focused on math, and STEM education in K through 12. And Lord knows that problem has not been solved and gone away. But I think there's an increasing understanding that it's not just the skills that prepare kids and start opening doors for the ones who want to pursue STEM careers. But it's also this issue that you mentioned, that when you've completed your education at whatever level, the range of jobs that now are becoming available, the technologies we've all been driving have led to automation that has eliminated some jobs, but of course it has thrown open whole new categories of jobs. And this issue of I think for so long companies have used a bachelor's degree as a proxy for a set of, like a check mark, because it represents, at least in theory, it represents a certain set of skills or capabilities or accomplishments. And I think moving away from that is going to, we have so many people who are completely able to do a whole set of very interesting jobs that compensate better, that are going to allow them to support their families. And we have these jobs that we're not getting filled because of the mismatch. And I think that is one of the areas where I think there's room for some real progress. And I see a lot of innovative companies who are taking active steps now to make sure that they're recruiting for the people with the skills they need, not necessarily with a bachelor's degree. And I think that's
and the tremendous training programs of the skilled labor unions, such as the electrical workers, the pipe fitters and plumbers. I mean, it's amazing, their training and how they work closely with companies to affect that. I know we have a few minutes before Secretary Raimondo's joining us, so we've talked about semiconductors, and you alluded to biofabrication and some other areas and the forefronts of life sciences and our health system, and we'd love to hear some of your thoughts on kind of the frontiers and, again, your role at OSTP working with HHS and the entire country on this.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the joy in the world of science and technology and innovation is the horizons that research keeps throwing open. And so some of the things that we are working on today, we recently supported, and the president now has signed an executive order on biomanufacturing and the bioeconomy. And I think that, everyone understands that semiconductors are the foundation of the information age, but I think what's less visible is how biology and our ability to engineer cells is starting to play that role for much of our physical world, because our ability to design with cells allows us to build molecules and chemistries and materials and even structures that sometimes to replace the things that right now we're drilling up, dead dinosaur materials, right, to get these amazing complex molecules that we need for fuels and specialty materials. Number one, we can do that in a much more sustainable way, but now we can also do things that we can build things that no one's ever actually been able to do before. I know Steve Walker's here. When he and I got to team up and run DARPA during the 2012 to 2017, one of our projects was about engineering microbes so that the military could take them out to a remote region, lay them down on the ground, and essentially have them grow a concrete runway instead of pouring one. Well, now we're in a different category of what biology can do. We're just at the start of that, and if we're going to realize that potential, we've got barriers of regulation to knock down. We've got barriers of process scale up to work on. So those are some of the areas where I think we can look not just to existing technologies, but some of the new things that are coming, and knock down barriers so that we can get there and make them actually useful for people.
Well, having been director of DARPA, but also NIST, where you played a role in the critical standard setting process for this country, as well as user facilities, and NIST standards on cybersecurity are still the best really in the world. But you've alluded to the dual use and national security implications of these exponential technologies, and that's part of your portfolio as well, as science advisor. And what do you see really as the challenges but the opportunities of America's international collaboration? Yes, in climate and energy, but in some of these very, very sensitive and transformative technologies.
There are so many things that we can't do by ourselves, so we're going to need our allies for virtually everything that we're doing. And there are places that we will be, where we're going to be in conflict with China and we're competitors, but even there are very vital global goals, climate the most significant one, where we have to continue to find ways to work together. And I think your point about standards is a really critical one, because that is a great example of something that just underpins so much of commerce and how the future unfolds. But we have tended, I think, we've taken a little bit more for granted than we should, and I think coming to view that as a strategic element in how we prepare for the future that's an important lever as well. So I'm glad you mentioned that.
And our other former director from NIST, Walt Copen's here, who's played a big leadership on that as well. But it links over into our trade policy very much. And I know right now there's some friction with the EU with some of the provisions in the CHIPS Plus Act about domestic manufacturing. And I know that's also an area where you have to play a leadership role as we forge these partnerships, but also recognize that other countries have been doing local content for years, and maybe it's time for the U.S. to also do some provisions for domestic manufacturing.
Yeah, and I think look, part of our strategy as we think about economic competitiveness, an explicit part of that is how we work with our allies, and I know the President's been very clear that we're going to work through these issues. And at the end of the day, we are going to be able to make the advances that we need for the American people and do it in a way that lifts up the whole world and our collaborations with our allies. So that's where we have to get to.
Well, in the last few minutes before the Secretary arrives, I know you're an optimist because you do things that are...
Because we keep coming to work every morning.
And made the decision to come back from California to Washington for the third time. What are you excited about? We were talking this morning about goals, looking ahead. When you finish as science advisor, what are some of the things that you really hope you can accomplish under your watch? Because you've got a great plate to start, and we know there'll be important things because we know you, but share with us some of your ideas.
Well, I will tell you the headline for me is and I think the work before us, and very much my personal passion, is how do we strengthen the R&D system that we have, but also initiate a shift so that it's as good at meeting our aspirations for this century as it was for the aspirations of the last century, because it is a beast of the last century, and I think it does need to be really focused on the challenges that we're facing now. But what does that really look like? That probably looks like imagining a future where we drive the leading edge of artificial intelligence and we make sure that we're using it in a way that reflects American values. It might mean a future in which we boot up a bioeconomy that's a strong foundation for many, many different parts of what we're doing across the physical infrastructures that we have. We've made huge progress with the Inflation Reduction Act on deploying clean energy technologies, but we've got a lot more work to get to net zero by 2050. That success on that would be high on my list as well. So I think there's a long list, but it's really going to be all about science and technology changing what's possible for this century.
And so if you think of the current agenda and the Sputnik moment, this tremendous legislation that's been passed, we in this room are very committed to working as we can on the appropriation side in a bipartisan way. And do you feel optimistic that we're going to get the resources beyond the authorization for things such as NIST and NSF and all the tremendous opportunities and STEM, et cetera, in that legislation?
Yeah, I think your CHIPS and Science, of course, appropriated dollars to move out on the CHIPS side, and then authorized a number of new initiatives and expansions in the and science part. And to me, that authorization is a gold-plated invitation to go to work and try to build those budgets. And the president has been very clear in his commitments to R&D broadly and to those particular areas. And he has put forth the most substantial R&D budgets that we have ever had. And so I think you should count on continuing to see a strong commitment from the administration and working with appropriators to try to get as far as we can get on those authorizations.
So we're going to be launching, as I said, next March, the second phase of our National Innovation Commission of the Council, continuing our work with our CTOs and our University Presidents Forum, advanced computing, et cetera. And again, on exponential technologies, place-based innovation, sustainability, the future work will be our priorities. What are your recommendations of what this organization can do to help ensure this path we're on not only sustainable but accelerates into the future? And we would love your recommendations to us.
I have known this organization and worked with it over many, many decades, and you've been arguing, you've been pulling people together across all these different areas, and you have been arguing for the things that matter for this country for a long time. And I would encourage you to keep pushing on that agenda. And I think we're all very aware of how quickly the world changes with technologies and geopolitics shifting. So keeping an eye on how are we doing, let us know how we're doing, but also how do we need to keep adapting for how the world's actually unfolding. That'll be very, very helpful.
Thank you. And I know you have a time constraint here, so I want to be sensitive to that as we await the arrival of the Secretary. But maybe on a personal level, you've had this incredible career. You came here as a 3-year-old, as I said, and then went on to go to Caltech and do all the things that you have accomplished as a woman. What is your advice for young people today, and particularly women? We have this deficit of women going into the STEM fields. We're making progress, but not enough. When you speak to young people, how do you encourage them about the future? We heard today they're not digital nomads, they're app nomads.
App nomads, okay,
which
right.
Is not so good.
Because digital is digital's been there, done that, I think. That's right, okay. I have to tell you, I think actually it might be harder today to be optimistic as a young person than it was when I was young. And I think one of the things we can all do is remind ourselves and the next generation, it's easy to see the problems we're leaving them, but I think it's also good to remember how much progress we've made. If you think about civil rights, if you think about gay rights, if you think about the rights that women have in our society, the progress that we've made is actually quite significant, and you know, it represents American values that are worth fighting for and worth coming in to work for every single day. And since we're talking about history, I'm going to tell a story about you and me, Deborah.
All right.
So I have to say that my favorite memory across many years of working with Deborah is Election Day in 1996, where the two of us, Deborah had worked in the Bush senior administration, I worked in the Clinton administration, but that election day you would have found us in a high school in McLean, Virginia, standing in line together to vote. I was pregnant with my first child, and she had one of her kids in a stroller. And, you know, to me, that was just like a perfect moment of democracy, because we knew we were going to cancel each other out, and it didn't matter, because we stood there together, you know, with our kids and one on the way, and we got to participate in what this country's all about. So what a pleasure. Thank you.